Namaste and welcome to everybody for this is the fifth in a series of classes that we've been doing about the topic of fear and relating to a book that has recently been released by Crystal Clarity Publications and Ananda Publications, How to Live Without Fear in the Wisdom series of Yogananda. And so I very much recommend that book if you have availability to it. It's on in print version right now. It's coming out in America, which will soon be in India. But also it will be, and I think it is available now online, Kindle books, that sort of thing. And if you have a chance, pick it up and add it to your library. Now today is the last, as I say, of the classes in this series, and I'm going to wrap up. In conclusion, but also it's a chance for you, if you have questions, to put them in the chat box, and we'll get, depending on how many of chat questions that come in, we'll answer those as best as I can. And I know I have a couple to start off. A couple came in dealing with anxiety, and so I'll begin on that topic and just kind of sum up what we've been talking about these last 4 weeks. But let us begin today with a prayer. Divine Mother, great masters, beloved Guruji, we offer our lives to Thee. In Thy presence, where can fear reside? Thou art our protection, Thou art our guide. Thou art our constant presence as a friend. Beloved Lord, be with us always. Om Shanti, 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 Amen. Now, this topic of fear, anxiety, worry, these sorts of things, they're everywhere. And then they can manifest in can seemingly very significant ways, things that actually affect our lives. And of course, there's all sorts of minor things. You might say your neighbor, your friend, or relative have some very minor fear, but it's very big for them, and it may seem trivial to you. We can't judge these things from one person objectively, outwardly, what we should be afraid of or not afraid of. Yes, some things seem to be obvious, but nevertheless, it's a very personal thing. And a couple of lessons that come from that, and we've covered pretty much most everything that as an approach and an attitude, how to overcome that, and what Master said in his books and his writings, and what all of us have learned, I think, somewhat through our own experiences in life. And I'm going to begin by remembering a story that applied to me, and then a story that I'm going to share with you. And in Swami Kriyananda's autobiography, he mentioned when he was a boy that there was a bully in one of the schools, and common for, those things happen. And the bully was always, it was picking on him and wanting to pick a fight, and eventually cornered him. And since his bully was older and quite a bit larger than Swamiji was at that time in his life, the bully pretty much had his way with Swami, and he was beating him up. But Swamiji just took it. He just let the bully, because he didn't have much choice really, but he wasn't going to submit mentally or emotionally. And the bully just kept pounding on him. And finally, the bully saw that he was not going to be able to subdue him in the sense of making him fearful of him. So he wasn't afraid. He couldn't do anything, but he just decided to take it. And eventually the bully gave up. And of course, the bully somewhat lost face with all the other people in the room, because he was obviously bigger and he couldn't subdue Swami. And so he backed off. And eventually, as Swami says, once that happened, as days and weeks and months went by, the bully no longer bothered him. He was, you might say, that he gave up on him. And I had an experience like this when I was a boy, and it taught me a very, very good lesson. I remember I was about 10 years old, and as is certainly in my neighborhood, I don't know about your neighborhood, these things were like that. It was a rough neighborhood. And there was a group of boys, about, I'm going to guess 3. I was only 10, and so they were probably 13, maybe a little. They were bigger, and they were older. And I was with another friend, and they cornered us. And my young friend escaped, you might say, but I couldn't escape, and these guys beat me up. And I had a scar on my face, I remember, for years after that. And but it was physically not pleasant, obviously, but that wasn't the bad part of it. It was the emotional trauma of having this bully beat me up, one particular one of them. And for years afterwards, probably 2, 3, 4 years afterwards, I was afraid of this guy. And he dominated my consciousness, you might say, in anywhere, because I was always on the lookout for him, trying to avoid him. And it was he never, I never really encountered him too much after that. But yet he was in my mind, and I was afraid of him, and I just didn't like it, and it influenced me, what I did, where I went, what was happening. I was kind of always, aware. Where is this fellow for a few years? Well, anyway, some years later, at about, let's say 3 years later, somewhere like that, I was in another situation with a friend, and this group of boys, not this same group, different one, this group of boys surrounded a friend of mine and started to harass him and bully him. And, they got into a fight. And I was there, and I could have stepped forward to help my friend, but I didn't. I was afraid. And my friend ends up getting beat up a little bit. And afterwards, I was so ashamed of myself. Why didn't I help him? My loyalty, I didn't prove my loyalty to him. And it was such a regrettable thing that I carried that with me. And that was worse, you can say, than actually getting beat up myself, to not step forward at a point to defend and help my friend. And so I carried those, and I resolved. I says, I'm never going to do that again. I'm not going to do that, because I was diminished in my own eyes, and because I regretted it. And they, now I've learned in the years since, of course, Paramhansa Yogananda said that we're drawn back into this world for two main reasons: desires. I want this, I want that. Or secondly, regrets. I should have done this, I should have done that. Oh, I did such, And if you could say anything, it's not good to have regrets, because they draw us back. But if I could say one good thing about regrets, they can, if we feel them strong enough, we can change our behavior. And I said, well, no, I'm not going to do that again. And then this whole thing, and I thought, what does that bully finds me? What's the worst thing that's going to happen? He's going to beat me up, and and I'm going to have physical pain, and there's some humiliation of getting beat up, and I'm going to beat up in some way. My ego is not going to like it. But I said, that's better, than being regretful because I didn't step forward when I probably should have to help. And I don't know if I could have helped or not, but for myself, it was important to do that. Well, this is, I think, in a sense, the point of this is, if you have fears, and I think we all have fears, and they come in many forms. When you're a boy or a young person like that, maybe that's something, tussling with bullies is one physical way. But when we get older, my experience has been those sorts of things don't arise too often. There's not too many times when you have to step forward physically to protect something or to do something. But there's all sorts of other fears that come up. The fears, you might say, of not the physical body, but your emotions being hurt. And so you don't do something when you perhaps should have done something, or it would have been better. You're afraid. It's for some other reason. Or perhaps you're afraid to step forward because you're going to look silly, or you're afraid it's an egoic thing. There's all of these things, and then you start to encounter those. And when, and whenever those things have happened in the years since, I've looked at it and I said, what's worse, to regret, allow something in your life to control you, is because that's what really fear does, is you become paralyzed, you don't act, you act in a way that isn't perhaps rationally the best thing to do. And that's what fear does when you get paralyzed. Your emotions, you're directed by emotional reaction, you might say. Fear is an emotional, rather than rational. And it objective, positive things that you could do. And also, as I did mention this, is because it's an emotional reaction, which is directed from you might say, a more primitive part of our mentality, our brain, it also blocks off the higher aspects of our ability to move forward. In other words, the rational side of ourselves, well, this is not the best way to behave. Not if I thought about it rationally without being emotionally overwhelmed by the situation. And also, I think for the devotee, the deeper problem is that not only is the rational mind paralyzed a little bit, but also the intuition begins to be blocked off. Because we've contracted into more of a subconscious, primitive way of reacting, and the higher faculties, rationality, and particularly intuition, a sense of guidance of what's the right thing to do. Like the right thing to do as I was a boy, I should have stepped forward and helped my friend. But I reacted in the other way and it got blocked off. But then later you come and remember it and you regret it. Well, it's the same. This is what happens with all sorts of fears. And even things that are, you might say, not an immediate fear, but something that you're anxious about. And I think this is when we speak about fear, yes, there are instances where we actually fear something in front of us, but probably more prevalent, it's that big question of what if, what if that happened? What if a loved one of mine passed away? What would I think? What would I feel? Oh my gosh! And what if I lost my job? What if I was impoverished? What would I do? What would I do if this circumstance? What if that circumstance? And it can pretty soon these what ifs can be kind of small, really, in the large perspective, but in the immediate moment, we tend to lose perspective. And some little thing, hey, what if that happens? All of a sudden I'm consumed by it. And this question of what if, you could sort of say the monster behind the curtain that might be there. You're probably not, but it might be there. And what do we do about that? And how do we deal with that? Well, all of these things, I think, come back to the lesson that I learned, at least for myself. And of course, each of you will have to learn your own. But one thing that does not work is to run away from it. It just doesn't work because you run away from it, but the bully's still there. And then because you've run away from it, you're then afraid of it and you just can't face it. Well, this is the first thing I think, and I think the lesson I've learned is if something is bothering you, you have a problem, you have a difficulty, what if that happened, is you have to overcome it. I've found I have to be able to face it. And it doesn't mean I like it. I don't like it. But it's not about liking it or disliking it, things of this world. It's the willingness to face our fears and those things that are potential, and to get to the point where I may not like it, but I can accept the fact that if it comes, I'm going to respond to it, and I'm going to do what's necessary. And I think, you could take this to what I say next, you could take it to excess, and some people do. So I'm not saying that, in a sense, you could worry and worry and worry about it, or you could obsess about what if that happened and what am I going to do? What if that happened? What am I going to do? But in the sense of, in the process of learning to accept it, we do have to anticipate it, you see, but not to the excessive extent where it begins to dominate us. but to get to the point where, okay, if these things happen, yes, I can deal with that. And maybe I can't deal with it, but I'm ready if and should it come. Now, there's a tendency, I think it's part of human nature, and I think this is part of anxiety particularly, is the human consciousness. We like things to be fixed. We like a certain security. We like to know what's going to happen. We like to think, maybe even take it a step further, we like to think we can control things. And we want things to be controllable in life. We don't like chaos to some degree. Now, I think to some degree, I think chaos is somewhat fun in a way if you don't know what's going to come. But it's only, you might say, somewhat enjoyable if you've learned to be able to enjoy the uncertainty of life, the uncertainty of situations. I know my duty has been in public speaking and outreach, sharing these teachings with others, and sometimes you find yourself in audiences. And I've noticed that some public speakers and people that have done this sort of work, they say, well, yeah, it's okay, but I don't really like the questions and answers because what are they going to ask me, and I may not be able to answer it. And I says, well, if they ask you a question, you don't know the answer, you just say, I don't know the answer. Doesn't that make sense? And but nevertheless, it can be a little bit, some people find it nerve-wracking that they're not going to be prepared for whatever comes in life. But I think this is in a sense what we all do. We're all on the stage, and life is giving us questions of which we're supposed to give an answer, whether we know the answer or not. And in that vein, questions and answers I found to be quite fun because sometimes they're very strange questions and they're way out there, and I'm stumped. And I think sometimes the audience enjoys stumping the speaker, but it's okay. We're all in this together. Now, life presents us with all these sorts of things, but we do, it is in our nature. We want a certain security. We want a certain certainty. But I have to ask the question, I think all of us have lived long enough to know, is life ever certain? It's just not made that way. There's always, we can't rest, or find security by trying to get everything in order. And I know some people become very obsessed with that. I got to have everything in its right place, everything in a certain way, because if it's not, they get upset, and I think it leads to a certain amount of insecurity. And I think anxiety is a little bit, if we feel that anxiety, what if this, what if that, because life is like that. It's uncertain, and life is chaotic in the sense that it's too complex for us to be able to, with this human mind, to be able to perceive what's going to happen, why it's happening. Now, it's a very fascinating topic, but it's something I think to remember. Keep this in mind. If we find ourselves insecure with chaotic situations, I say learn to be able to accept it. Life itself is chaotic, but yet it is not random. Now there's a difference between chaos and randomness. Randomness implies that there's no cause and effect relationship going on. It's just totally beyond that. But chaos means that there is an order to life. It's just that it's too complex for us to understand. And that's the difference. And it does not mean that in the midst of chaos, there is no purpose. You see, modern society tends to some people in modern society lean toward the idea that, well, it's all random, there's no purpose to anything. That's called nihilism. And life is without purpose. And this is a disease, I think, that society as a whole suffers from. And so since there's no purpose, anything is okay. No, underneath there is a purpose. It's just that we don't always understand it. And you could say the art of living is to learn that underlying purpose of life. And one way, and it's, and I think it could lead to insecurity. If there's, we don't know what's going to come. But I think life, in my experience, is life, if we can approach life in chaotic situations and actually maybe enjoy the chaos a little bit, that there is an underlying purpose and life is a flow. And if we could see life in terms of a flow, rather than a rational this follows that, but it's just in a flow, you find that you begin to be able to enjoy the flow. And I think approaching life as an art rather than as a science. That Kriyananda would always say, many people go to art school and they learn the techniques of art. But how many become good artists? Because it takes something more than technique in order to become a good artist. And I think this applies particularly to living life. Life can be approached as a science. So the facing fear can be approached as a science. Oh, I've got to remember to do that. I've got to remember to face it. All of these things we've talked about, you can approach it. And then when you're in the middle of fear, something's frightening you, all of that goes out the window anyway, because you can't remember any of it. You're just afraid. And so I think it takes a certain attitude. And an attitude is more in terms of an art, of how we approach life. And if we think of life more as a spiritual flow, and our job is to get into the flow of responding in a certain way to life, responding what happens to life. And underneath that is not to try to stop what's coming next. Oh, no, not that. Oh, no, not that, not that. That you can't get into a flow by, if you're in a dance, a free-form dance, is what happened before you. Okay, you take that and you go with it and you do the next thing. There's a certain amount of improvisation. There is such a thing called improvisational theater, which is kind of a fun exercise. Actually, which I've done this with. It doesn't work online, but if you have a small group of people, in a class, you start a conversation and a story, and you get to a certain point, and you stop, and then the next, okay, you're up, and that person's got to take that story and then just fill it out, and they go for about 15 seconds, and they're stopped, and the next person, and they just, and some people just cannot do it. They cannot do it, with practice, everybody can do it. And you just pick up the story where it left off, and then you go in this other direction, and it can really, really be hilarious and fun. But it takes practice. But it's the flow. One thing leads to another, and approaching life more in an artistic way rather than a staccato of logical events. Now, what does this have to do with fear? I think it's just an approach to life. If we're willing to accept whatever that previous person said, whether it's ridiculous and I'm just going to pick it up, and I'm going to go to the next thing, and I do not resist. I accept. Oh, that's life. And what life gives me, I'm going to take next. And it's not a matter of liking it or why did you say that? That was a dumb thing to say. Well, okay, it does not matter if it was dumb or threatening or whatever. How do I respond to life, you see? Not just reacting, responding to it, in some meaningful way. And I think the ability to train ourselves to approach that, and it's a certain amount of sense of attunement, of what does it take? In other words, What does it take to become an artist as opposed to a technician? And this applies to everything in our life, in terms of our employment, what we do in our life, just not to be technical about it all. And you could take this, of course, here we are, we meditate, we do spiritual practices, and people approach spiritual practice. I want to attain enlightenment, and this is step 1, step 2, step 3. What's step 5? I want to take the next step. Well, it's admirable. One wants to do these things, but have we got into the flow of what underneath the technique? What is trying to happen here? And as we're trying to get into this flow of life, so whatever comes to us, we can just very gracefully, with poise, pass it on to the next person, or respond to it appropriately. And I think if we feel comfortable in the midst of chaos, I think to some degree it's an antidote to anxiety. The anxiousness of, because you can't give a logical, and if you're anxious, do X, Y. If X comes, I'm going to do Y. You can't approach it that way. You have to say, when X comes, improvise. And you do that, but improvise in a positive direction. Improvise your life. Take the next step that's going to, whatever you can do in the next moment that's going to improve your situation and take you toward that which is higher, that which is going to be joyful, that is which is going to be more satisfying. So as I look back upon my experiences with being ashamed of myself because I didn't help my friend in a time of need, I said, I'm not going to do that again. I'd rather have the fellow beat me up, rather like Swami. He allowed that fellow to say, yeah, I'm not going to become a servant of this, let that person dominate me. He may be stronger, he may in every other way, but inwardly, I'm not going to allow somebody to touch me and grab hold. And I'm not going to let fear. I'm not going to let anxiety. And I'm going to go on like Master said, a worry fast. I'm just not going to do it. And that positive affirmation that I'm going to be poised in the moment. I'm going to be poised in God. Now there's a deeper side to this. And or not a deeper side, but there's an example I want to share with you, and I've wrote it down here somewhere. It's a wonderful poem that encapsulates a little bit of our approach to life and fears and anxieties. And it's a poem that Paramhansa Yogananda liked, and he wrote rewrote it in a version which I don't have here, but I'm going to share just the original. And it's a poem by an Englishman who was named Sir Francis Thompson. Now, probably 19th century, somewhere back there. And it's a poem, it's called The Hound of Heaven. And many of you perhaps have read this. And very beautiful. And it's about a man who's running away because he's perhaps out in the wild lands in England somewhere. And anyway, there's this ferocious hound, chasing him. And he's running away, trying to escape. And as he said, and I'll read some of the words, he says, I fled him down the nights and down the days. I fled him down the arches of the years. I fled him down the labyrinthine ways of my own mind, and in the midst of tears, I hid from him, and so on. He goes on in this way, and he's running, and this hound is just, after him. So he runs and runs, but he's getting tired. And he says, he's becoming exhausted, and he knows that this hound is catching him. And of course, this is all very allegorical and symbolic, is because he's running, as all of us do, from life. He's running from his fears. He's running from those things that are threatening to him, or that he's perceived as being threatened. But of course, the hound, as the title of this poem implies, it's the hound of heaven. It's God himself who is chasing him through all the challenges, through all the difficulties, and mankind is afraid. The man is afraid, and he runs from God. And until finally he gets exhausted, and finally, the hound catches him, and the man is terrified. And the hound catches him and says to him, he can't flee any further. And the hound says, "Fear not," or that which he was fleeing from, says, "Fear not. Whom wilt thou find to love ignoble thee? Save me, save only me." In other words, accept me. I'm the only one that is going to love you, that you've been fleeing all your life. You've been fleeing. Who else is going to love you except me? And then he says these words, "All which I took from thee, I did but take not for thy harms, but just that thou mightst seek it in my arms. All which thy child's mistake fancies as lost, I have stored for thee at home. Rise, clasp my hand, and come." You can see everything I've taken, so you can say, for God, everything I've taken from you, it's not for your harm. The difficulties, the things you're afraid of, all of these things, I took it. It's a child's mistake. I took it for anything you've lost, friends, you're anxious for the passage of friends and family, children, job, money, possessions, all of these things I've taken from you, not to harm you. And if we could see it in the larger context, rise, clasp my hand, and come. And then the man who's been running, he says, halts by me that footfall. In my gloom, he comes to this resolution, in my gloom, after all, shade of his hand outstretched caressingly. In other words, his gloom, all the things he has feared, was merely the shadow of God reaching down to him to help him, to lift him up. Is my gloom, after all, shade of his hand, outstretched caressingly? And then the hound says to him, "Ah, fondest, blindest, weakest, I am he whom thou seekest. Thou dravest love from thee who dravest me." Dravest, the old way of saying drive away. So he says, you drive away love from yourself, those who drive away me. And so I think in the sense, you could say, we feel fear comes when we're alone. We don't have a friend standing beside us. We don't have a friend who's there to help us, to protect us, to fight for us on our side. And I think that's a mistake. It's a mistake. And I think in this whole spiritual path is one is coming to the realization that we do have a companion right there. We're not in this alone. This life is not random. There is purpose, there's meaning, and we need to find that. But again, coming back, to live with fear, to allow fear to control us, to make us do things that we wish we wouldn't have done, might have done different, that's worse, I think, than to just accept the fact that I'm going to get beaten up by life. Maybe will beat me up, but it's better to stand up in that way rather than to allow it to control me. And then we find that we're not by ourselves. We're not by ourselves. When we really are just able to accept and face, we find a lot of those things, they just melt away. So if you take this in the spiritual sense, we run away from God, but God continues to pursue us. And in the running, of course, life can seem cruel, it can seem unfair, all of these things. But and this hope that we can protect ourselves from life ends up just binding us. We end up putting all these constraints around ourselves. And eventually, the soul is going to rebel against that. So why wait? Because anything that constricts our freedom, constricts us and makes us feel smaller, sooner or later, we're just going to say, I'm not going to stand it anymore. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to stand up. So why wait and put ourselves through all this suffering? Stand up now, accept the fact that life has its vicissitudes, and as Master said, be cautious, but never be afraid. And you could say, attach yourself. The answer here is not to run away, but to attach yourself to something higher. Attach yourself to God, attach yourself to that companion. You'll find you can then, you could say, face anything that comes to you. So take this, you might say, as our parting thought. Face your fears if you have them. They're natural. They're something that all of us have them. Face them, accept them as best you can, and face them and move toward your fear. If you understand what I mean, this in a deeper sense. Move toward it, not away from it. If you find yourself retreating, make it a tactical retreat. Sometimes you got to take one step back. Okay, gather yourself so that you can take 2 steps forward. Yeah, that's understandable. But your overall progress, you're moving toward the light rather than retreating from it and hiding from whatever it is that's threatening you. And so I'm going to, ask Bharat if he has if any questions have been submitted that, and I can give perhaps some final thoughts on whatever that might be. So, Bharatji,
yes.
is there any comment?
Yes, thank you. There is 3 or 4 questions.
Okay.
So the first one is, how can I keep calm and center when everything around me seems to be collapsing and chaotic?
Yeah, exactly.
How to keep trusting God and goals that I will be okay, and this is all temporary Maya?
Well, that's the thing. You see, it's easy for us to say these things, but then when the time comes, what do? There we are again. And I think it's like most things in life. You have to practice it again and again, coming back to that point of poise. Now, I think if I was to speak for myself, is that, we fail many times. And to be unsteady, to be frightened by something, that's okay. It's to be frightened by something and then act appropriately to counter it is, I think, what I'm trying to encourage. Not that you shouldn't feel fear. Because that is not necessarily a symptom of something wrong. It's a symptom of something threatening us. Now, there's a lesson in there, of course, that you might feel, but it's really what you do about it that is the important point now here. But what do you do, though? There you are. You're in a position of something's happened. What I've done, in my experience, is you have to stop that emotional reaction process and rechannel it. It's just energy channeled in one direction. How do we rechannel any emotional reaction into a positive direction? I think I would say the first thing is to stop and breathe. Now, I'm saying that, you might say symbolically, metaphorically, whatever, but I do mean it literally too. Gather yourself, breathe. Because oftentimes, physically, when you feel something frightful coming, you stop breathing. Your breath becomes very shallow, and it's a reflection of the tension that you have in the body. The body becomes tense, then you breathe very shallowly. But if you just relax the abdomen, the diaphragm, by breathing, right then you can gather yourself in the moment. And then you gathering yourself, and then you apply that which you've learned through experience, through maybe, you've gained a little bit because you failed in the past, and I'm not going to do that again. And you try to be poised. Now, poised, you could say, comes from remembering and attuning yourself to that which is poised and steady already. Fear, you might say, is a reflection of your wavering in indecision, and you're unsteady, you're unpoised. And you have what things in your life represent poise and steadiness and security. To me, that I would, and I think in maybe some other class I've said this, if I feel something insecure, something's bothering me, I relax physically, mentally, emotionally, take a deep breath, and this is physically, mentally, and emotionally, and I begin to think about Guru. Om Guru, Om Guru, Om Guru. And you have to train oneself to remember that. Remember that story of Dr. Lewis, who was in a sailboat, and a big storm comes up, and he's going to sink his boat, and so he lays down in the boat, and he looks up, and he hears the sound of Om. Now, Dr. Lewis, if you remember, had the ability to recall the divine light to the spiritual eye, and he looks into the spiritual eye, into the light. He recalls the Om vibration. And and this is something to remember, why we might want to become an advanced yogi. It is, Yogananda said, when you are in Om, nothing can touch you. Now that is protection. And so for me, calling on the Guru's grace, God's grace, if you can feel yourself, train yourself to feel the divine aura of protection around yourself, imagine it even, and just by that alone, even trying to do that takes you into a position of being actively engaged upon what's bothering, upsetting you, or threatening you. Because when you're threatened, you begin to think about yourself. You become self-absorbed in your own dilemma, difficulties, the object of your fear, and you forget to remember the higher protection. And whether you're, you could be atheistic about all of this and non-spiritual, you forget your inner self, your inner strength that you have yourself. But you have to be able to recall that. And this comes by a certain amount of training. And that becomes stronger, and then you're tested. And you're tested by little challenges during the day. And that's when you have to practice. You have to practice with little things, and that you can succeed with. Because then when the big challenges come, they're not overwhelming to you. So if you haven't practiced, it's hard. Or perhaps even impossible. And so this is what we have to do, is learn to be able to get that poise. Now I say, mentally face it, breathe. Now, yes, physically, but also it's recollecting ourselves. It's coming back to, okay, this is what I've trained myself for, this challenge. And I'm a trained person, and I'm going to be able to respond to this how do I respond to crocodiles that are coming at me? Well, I do the right thing. I do whatever it needs to be. But to be afraid of it and to just freeze up, it doesn't work. So all I can do is say you have to train yourself. And so that I would start with that. Next question.
Thank you, Jayaji. Do you have suggestions on how to overcome the fear that the work may not be done if I started? This person is saying that they're afraid that the things don't get started because of that fear. The work doesn't get done. So how to overcome the fear that if I start something, I may not be able to finish it?
It's true, you may not. So what? I mean, you see, there's two things here in these situations. There's the rational thing of what's happening, and the fear is the emotional reaction to what the objective problem is. You see, they're not the same. We have a problem, And then their fear is there. And the fear affects my ability to rationally or intuitively or dynamically work on the problem itself. And so what we're saying here is trying to separate these two things out. There's the objective situation, and there is the fear of the objective situation, or in this case, the fear of not doing something. And so it's really it's the fear that we want to get rid of. And because oftentimes we think it's the situation we want to get rid of. And I don't think maybe that is true in some degree, but it's really a different thing. And so we start avoiding the situation rather than solving the fear of that situation. And they're two different things, and we have to keep those straight. Because if we're not afraid of something, the fear part is not there, we can then approach it and we can do something. We can be effective, maybe, of at least try. And so it's the overcoming or the ability to deal with some emotional reaction. Now, let's say it's not fear, it could be other things. There's many emotional possibilities. A situation could arise that it causes you to emotionally get angry. Okay, the situation and the anger are two different things. A situation comes up, you emotionally get jealous, perhaps, of something. It's irrational to some degree. Or not, and then, but you see, there's many things in life. There's a long list of potential emotions versus the situation, and so we have to discriminate between those. And you'll find that I have found that if you learn to respond and to one sort of emotional reaction, it helps you with everything else too. They're all intertwined. It's the reactive process, and this is what we speak about in yoga. And how do we learn to overcome the reactive process, whatever the emotion might be? It's by being detached, by being able to withdraw ourselves, to separate ourselves from this body, this emotional body. And this is why we meditate. This is why we practice Kriya Yoga. And so if I could reference here, which I probably should have already, I should remember Lahiri Mahashaya. Solve all problems with Kriya Yoga. Become less subject to the reactive process of life. Now that sounds quite philosophical, but don't let philosophy get in your way. It's true. So practice. Next question.
Thank you, Jaya. And the next question is, how can you help other people with their fears apart from something like praying and things like that? How can you help someone overcome their fears when you know something is coming and they are not going to be able to handle it?
I think by being a good example and wrapping your aura around other people. And if people, if I find that fear is contagious, panic is contagious. Groups have a group dynamic where fear, and the principle behind that in a group is why all of a sudden do people, things start happening in a group that become not rational. They become it can become negative, and so if we know that happens, we can use that to our benefit. And you put yourself into an environment that is peaceful, calm, that is uplifting. We become affected by it. So okay, now that's us as the one who's being affected, but the person affects others by also projecting their aura to be able to envelop other people. And just like, I mentioned this evening that we started out our discussion about Swami Kriyananda's example from his autobiography. In a sense, just even me reading that, it was something I somewhat knew intuitively, but I says, yeah, that's a good example of that. And so we can be a calming influence. And you could look at many instances in the life of Paramhansa Yogananda, and I look at them in life of Swami Kriyananda, whereas their influence just affected the whole environment. There was a funny little story, I wouldn't say it's funny, instructive story from the early days of when Swami Kriyananda started our community here. This would have been in 1969. There was a little, we had purchased at that time, he had purchased a piece of property which he began as an Ananda meditation retreat. That later developed into the Ananda Village and the community. But at first it was just that property. And right by that community or that retreat, there was in the forest there was a pond. And when we would come back and forth sometimes, we'd go over to the pond, and on a hot day, you go swim in that pond. Well, it was on public property, and it was very remote. And one day, Swami Kriyananda was there with a group of others. They stopped by, let's go swimming on the way home. And they went over to the pond, and there was an encampment of some very, very rough characters, and they had their camp there right by the pond, and these were the kind of guys. They had lots of guns and pistols and knives, and they were really rough looking guys. And so anyway, they were over there, and so Swami, this story was told to me by Satya, an early member who's now long passed. But they went there, and they went swimming. There was about 3 or 4 of them there. And these fellows were there on the other side by the bank, drinking beer and carousing, and they were throwing their beer cans in the water, kind of low life activity like that. And so Swami sees that happening, and Swami says to him, hey, don't be throwing your beer cans in the water, in the lake. And, these guys, were just the kind of that didn't take advice easily like that. So I said, what do you mean? Who are you? So Swami, he says, I'm a guy, I live close by. I'm a philosopher and a poet. And Swami at this time, he starts walking, makes his way, swims a little bit, and he starts walking toward them, you see. He's going right toward them, and, these guys are pretty rough. And they see him come, drink, and they were probably half drunk. And so Swami just goes, hey, I'm a neighbor here, and I'm a poet, and I'm a philosopher, and, and throwing your beer can, so he gives him a little ecological lecture. And so he just coming along, and they see this guy coming, and for whatever reason, they just start to back up. You see, but Swami was not angry. He was not unfriendly, but he had a certain aura to him that he just kept. And they were very surprised. And he says, yeah, here, come on, I want you to introduce my friends. Come on, let's. And nobody else was walking forward. Everybody else was kind of going, oh, no. But Swami says, come on. So they all came, they came and they walked forward and, and introduced themselves. And these guys were so taken aback, that, and the situation resolved itself. And they, Swami and the other people with him went their way. Well, I don't think most people would have done that, and or it would take a very, you might say, courageous. But Swami wasn't thinking in terms of being courageous. He was just something that come up, and you could see this, and he moved toward it. But he had an aura of confidence and just a surety, and he was peaceful. I'm a poet, and I'm a philosopher and a poet, and these, these fellows, they were somewhat ignorant, I think, just spiritually ignorant. And they were intimidated by Swami in a way that they just backed up and the incident passed. And I think this was a good lesson, a good way. And he wasn't afraid. And I do think if we want to encourage the others that were with Swami, were very encouraged by that. So you could say that if you want to help others, become strong yourself and become a bearer of light rather than just a receiver of light. See, because that's what a devotee goes to, that evolutionary stages, all of us do, is we want to be in the light. We want to receive the light. We want to take in blessing. But that's a beginning only. We have to get to the point that when we start there, but where we want to be an instrument of that light. It's not our light, you see. But to the degree that we can overcome the reactive process, we become a channel for that light. And so consequently, in the overcoming of our own reactive process, we become an instrument that, you could say, that filter, that blockage is removed, and then the light can shine through us outwardly. And you can direct that and help other people with that. And you find that oftentimes those things that are perceived as obstacles, really, they're just creating shade. An obstacle does that. An obstacle blocks the light and creates shade. But you find that really you confront it and it somewhat melts away. So in a sense, this is what we can't change the world around us directly necessarily, but we can be an instrument for those forces in the universe that do create change in a positive way. The future is not fixed in that way. The future is malleable and things happen, and we are creating the future right now by our own attitudes and the way we approach it. And the future, and we get to the point, and I think this is for us as spiritual seekers, we have an influence on the world around us. The world conforms. That Swami Ramtirtha sung, the world stands aside to make way for me. And that's how it is. The world will conform to accommodate you in some fashion. If you do this in the right way. It's not that you have to, and you don't, this is what fear does, that fear makes you accommodate to whatever is that object of fear, rather than you being the force, and life responds appropriately, harmoniously, ideally here, to you. So give that some thought. Okay, Bharat, any further ones?
Yes, thank you for that answer. It was wonderful. And visualizing Swamiji saying that to the people, I never heard that before. It's quite amazing.
Yeah.
I'm a philosopher and a poet. The last question that we have right now is how to ignore people or perhaps work with people if people around you are frequently behaving irrationally or hurting you.
Well, sometimes, you can't, you'd say ignore is probably not, well, there's different ways to take that. In other words, people are acting in ways that are irritating, not fun for you, that are difficult, and they are being an instrument for forces that you don't like or agree with. Life is full of those folks, and to some degree, but it doesn't really come back to us and how we respond to it, how we react to it. I mean, to some degree, we have to be strong enough to absorb whatever's going on around us. And I don't mean that passively, because but if we think that we have to straighten everybody out and straighten the situation out, we're going to just be endlessly engaged in trying to untangle this world. And so that, to one degree, you do have to ignore or abide or absorb a certain amount of discord or whatever it is in your life. And if you can learn to do that, you find it doesn't bother you as much. The question comes back, why is it bothering you, really? That's what I often come back to. Something really irritates me. Somebody irritates me or something. And I have to ask myself, why? Why am I reacting this way to that? Why am I, because not that they're right, it's right or wrong. It's they're not, they're misbehaving perhaps by social standards, but yet their misbehaving is one thing. Their actions are one thing. But why do I feel the way I do is another thing. And that's my problem. The fact that they're misbehaving is their problem, and they're trying to make it my problem, but I'm not going to accept that as my problem if I can get to the root of why I'm reacting. And then, if we're clear on that, then we can be a force for perhaps changing another person's behavior and not, because sometimes people do things that aren't right, and maybe it is our duty to help correct that. But we have to also at the same time be very aware of our reaction to why this is bothering me or not bothering me. Sometimes it bothers us because I feel it's adharmic. Somebody's not doing something proper. They're harming other people. So, okay, then I'm trying to act as an instrument to that. But I have to separate it out. Is it really adharmic, or is it just, I don't like it? Which may not be the right, necessarily dharmic response to it. So we have to approach it in that way. And so just be clear with ourselves. And this is being honest with our own behavior and being, modifying it or doing whatever's necessary. But we can't be, people, we can't be so sensitive that, it bothers me, and their behavior is, that's weak. You don't want to be like that. Let it be water off the duck's back. You shouldn't allow yourself to be influenced or affected by the foibles of other people. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to agree with them, or sometimes it is your duty, to correct things. And, like even that story of Swami and the pond, they're throwing beer cans in there wasn't right, So Swami, I don't know if he had much hope of reforming those guys, but he did feel a necessity to say something, you see. But it wasn't from inner a negative feeling inward. It was just he felt it was the right thing to do, and he was clear. He wasn't angry. It just was you could say, a dharmic thing for him to say something. And maybe he said it because just to be an example to other people too, is that were with him, who may have been afraid of the consequences of that. I think you tie all these together, I think, and I think the answer's in there somewhere. But I do think, and I'll just conclude with these remarks, if we're standing alone in the face of adversity, it's difficult to bear the burden of all of this. But remember, we're not alone. There's a larger force at play. And if to the degree that we can bring the larger forces of this universe at play, and that there's a divine force of which we are a part of, and of course, the Guru is there in the background. The protection of the Guru is there. Babaji. I sometimes would just say, what, just call on that. And his devotees, Krishna responds to his devotees. Krishna protects his devotees. And for me, that's Babaji, Master. They protect their devotees. And you try to do the right thing. And whether it succeeds or fails outwardly is one thing. But if you try to act rightly, it succeeds inwardly. And in the long run, this is what you won't regret. You see, it's difficult to go and to not stand up for the right thing at the right time in the right way. You look back and you say, I should have done it. That's the regret. And then regrets, remember, pull us back. And you'll have to be challenged again until you get it right. So why wait? Do it now. God bless all of you, and thank you for sticking with us for these 5 classes. And I look forward. Next time we'll take a little break here, and we'll come back in a bit of time, and we'll have another topic to address. So in Master's blessings, go with joy. Have a wonderful day, wonderful evening. Joy to you.